Some secrets wait decades for the right soul to uncover them, and sometimes they choose a dog before they choose a man. At 4:21 on a bitter January morning near Sealy Lake, Montana, Atlas began digging beneath the cabin floor and refused to stop. The sound echoed through the darkness like a steady drumbeat, claws scraping against old wood that had not been disturbed in years. Caleb Walker sat upright on the narrow cot beside the fireplace, his pulse already racing before he fully opened his eyes. For a moment, he thought it was another nightmare, another restless night shaped by memories that still visited when the world grew quiet. The cabin was cold enough that his breath drifted through the room in pale clouds. Outside, snow whispered against the pine trees surrounding the property. Inside, Atlas continued digging. The German Shepherd's powerful shoulders moved with determination, sending dust into the air beneath the weak glow of a lantern resting on a nearby crate. "Atlas," Caleb said quietly. The dog didn't even look back. That alone was unusual. Atlas always listened, always checked, but now his focus remained locked on a section of floor near the old kitchen wall. Caleb swung his boots onto the floor and stood slowly. The cabin creaked around him, settling against the winter cold. 3 days earlier, a lawyer from Missoula had handed him ownership papers for the place. According to county records, the property was worth $50. $50 for a forgotten cabin hidden deep in the Montana wilderness. Most people would have laughed. Caleb almost had. Yet something about the place had kept him from walking away. Maybe it was because he had nowhere else to go. Maybe it was because Atlas had stared at the cabin the moment they arrived as if he recognized something hidden beneath its weathered boards. The dog suddenly growled low in his throat. Not a warning, not fear. Focus. Caleb moved closer. Atlas stepped aside and immediately lowered his nose toward the floor again. A loose plank had shifted under the force of his digging. Caleb crouched beside it. Dust coated the wood. His fingers brushed the edge carefully. The board lifted easier than expected. Beneath it lay darkness. For a second, neither man nor dog moved. Snow tapped softly against the cabin windows. Wind sighed through the trees beyond the walls. Then Atlas pushed his muzzle forward and sniffed. Caleb reached for the lantern and lowered it toward the opening. The warm light revealed a narrow space hidden beneath the floor. Old dirt, stone, something metallic. Atlas barked once, sharp, certain. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He reached down carefully and wrapped his fingers around the object buried beneath decades of dust. It felt cold despite the room's warmth, heavy, familiar. Slowly he pulled it free. The lantern light caught rusted metal hanging from a broken chain, an army identification tag. Caleb stared at it in silence. Time seemed to slow. The tag was old, much older than anything he had carried during his years in uniform. Dark stains marked one side. The letters were difficult to read beneath layers of corrosion. Atlas sat beside him, ears forward, watching, waiting. Caleb turned the tag over. The back side remained hidden in shadow. A chill moved through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. The county said this cabin was worth $50. The lawyer called it worthless. Yet beneath the floor of a forgotten cabin in the Montana wilderness, Atlas had just uncovered the first piece of a secret someone had buried long ago, and deep down, Caleb already knew one thing. The dog had not finished searching. Caleb held the rusted tag beneath the lantern for several long seconds, while Atlas remained perfectly still beside him. The cabin seemed quieter now, as if the old walls themselves were listening. Snow drifted across the windows. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wind moved through the forest with a low whisper. Finally, Caleb stood and carried the tag to the small wooden table near the fireplace. Atlas followed closely. The German Shepherd's amber eyes never left the object. "You knew something was here, did you not?" Caleb asked softly. Atlas tilted his head but said nothing, only resting his chin on the edge of the table. Caleb almost smiled. "Yeah, that is what I thought." He brushed away years of dust with an old cloth. Slowly, faded letters emerged from beneath the rust. The first name was difficult to read. The last name was almost completely worn away. But one detail stood out immediately. The date. 1973. Caleb frowned. That does not make sense. His uncle Walter had bought the property in the early 1990s. The tag had been hidden beneath the floor nearly 20 years before Walter ever arrived. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears pointed toward the front door. Caleb heard it a moment later. Tires crunching over snow outside. A vehicle. He set the tag down and stepped toward the window. A dark pickup truck rolled into the clearing and stopped near the cabin. Caleb watched carefully. A tall man stepped out, wearing an expensive wool coat and polished boots that looked completely out of place in the wilderness. The stranger glanced around the property before approaching the porch. Atlas released a low growl. "Easy," Caleb said quietly. There was a knock, 3 slow taps against the door. Caleb opened it halfway. Cold air rushed inside. The man smiled politely. Morning. You must be Caleb Walker. Caleb studied him. Who is asking? Victor Harlan. The man extended his hand. I own several properties around the lake. Caleb did not shake it. Victor lowered his hand without losing the smile. Word travels fast around here. Apparently. Victor glanced past Caleb into the cabin. His eyes moved briefly across the room. Too briefly. Too carefully. I heard you inherited this place. Something like that. Then perhaps we can help each other. Caleb said nothing. Victor continued. The property is not worth much. The road is difficult. Utilities are unreliable. Most people would not stay through winter. I am not most people. Victor laughed lightly. Fair enough. He reached into his coat and removed an envelope. $5,000. Cash offer. Today. Caleb looked at the envelope but made no move toward it. Atlas stepped closer to the doorway. The growl deepened. Victor glanced at the dog, beautiful shepherd. His name is Atlas. Well, Atlas seems protective. Caleb crossed his arms. What do you really want, Mr. Harlan? The smile on Victor's face flickered for the first time. Just for a second, then it returned. Like I said, business. Caleb nodded slowly. Then here is my answer. Victor waited. No. Silence settled between them. Snow drifted from the roof above. Victor tucked the envelope back into his coat. You should think about it. I already did. Victor looked toward the forest before turning back. Sometimes old places carry old problems. Caleb met his gaze. I have survived worse. Victor stood there for another moment, studying him. Then he nodded once and walked back toward his truck. Atlas watched until the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees. Only then did the dog relax. Caleb closed the door and looked down at him. You did not like him. Atlas stared at the door and gave a single quiet huff. Caleb glanced toward the rusted military tag resting on the table. Then he looked back toward the snowy road where Victor had vanished. Something told him the visit had not been about real estate, and for the first time since arriving, he began to suspect that whatever Atlas had uncovered beneath the floor was only the beginning. The storm arrived that evening with the quiet confidence of something that had been expected all along. Snow drifted steadily across the clearing, while darkness settled over the mountains. Inside the cabin, firelight flickered against the walls, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Caleb sat at the table, turning the rusted military tag over in his hands. Atlas lay near the fireplace, but unlike most nights, he was not resting. Every few minutes, the German shepherd lifted his head and glanced toward the kitchen. You keep looking over there, Caleb said. Either there is a mouse hiding in my new house, or you know something I do not. Atlas stood immediately. Caleb sighed. That answers that. The dog walked across the room and stopped beside the same section of floor where he had discovered the tag. His ears remained forward. His tail was still. Caleb watched him for several seconds. Then Atlas scratched once. Not wildly, deliberately. You want me to keep digging? Atlas scratched again. Caleb grabbed a flashlight and knelt beside the loose floorboards. The opening they had uncovered that morning was small, but now he noticed something unusual. The space beneath extended farther than it should have. Much farther. He directed the beam deeper into the darkness. Dirt, stone, old support beams, then something else. A narrow metal edge partially buried beneath years of dust. Caleb frowned. Well, that should not be there. Atlas stepped closer. Caleb reached into the opening and brushed away loose dirt. More metal appeared. A straight line, then another. It looked almost like a small hatch, hidden beneath the floor itself. His pulse quickened. What were you hiding down here, Walter? For the next hour, he carefully removed additional boards. Atlas remained beside him the entire time. By 9 o'clock, Caleb had exposed a rusted metal panel, roughly 3 feet wide. A ring handle sat in the center. He wrapped both hands around it and pulled. Nothing happened. He tried again. The hatch groaned but remained shut. Stubborn, Caleb muttered. Atlas huffed quietly. Yeah, I know, just like me. Caleb fetched an old pry bar from the truck. After several attempts, the seal finally broke with a sharp metallic crack. Cold air rushed upward from below. Not the cold of winter, a different cold, still ancient. Atlas immediately backed away 2 steps and stared into the darkness. Caleb aimed his flashlight downward. Stone stairs disappeared into the earth. He froze. The cabin suddenly felt much larger than before. Walter, what exactly did you leave me? The staircase descended farther than his flashlight could reach. Every instinct told him to wait until daylight. Every instinct also told him Victor Harlan probably knew this place held secrets. Caleb lowered himself onto the first step. Atlas followed without hesitation. Dust coated the stone. No footprints. No signs anyone had entered for years. 20 steps down, the staircase opened into a narrow underground corridor supported by old timber beams. The air smelled of cedar, earth, and time. At the far end stood a heavy wooden door reinforced with steel bands. Atlas moved ahead and sniffed near the base of the frame. Then he sat down. Caleb approached carefully. Mounted beside the door was a faded brass plaque. He wiped away dirt with his sleeve. The engraving became visible. His expression changed immediately. The plaque carried an official military insignia. Beneath it was a date, 1973, the same year stamped onto the rusted dog tag. Caleb felt a chill move through him. Then he noticed something else carved into the metal below. 3 words, deep, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Do not trust Harlan. Atlas stared at the door. Caleb stared at the warning. Somewhere above them, wind rattled the cabin roof. But down here, beneath the earth, an entirely different story had just begun. Caleb stood motionless before the reinforced door, while Atlas remained seated beside it, his eyes fixed on the weathered wood, as though he could hear echoes hidden beyond it. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly across the faded brass plaque. Do not trust Harlan, Caleb read quietly. The words hung in the cold air. Atlas responded with a low huff. You are really starting to make me think you know more than I do. He knelt beside the lock and brushed away decades of dust. The mechanism was old but intact. More surprising was the keyhole itself. It looked military, precise, deliberate. Caleb examined the rusted identification tag again. His eyes narrowed. Attached to the broken chain was a tiny metal piece he had not noticed before. Carefully, he inserted it into the lock. The fit was perfect. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. Then came a soft click. Well, Caleb whispered, that cannot be a coincidence. He pulled the heavy door open. Hinges groaned softly. A rush of stale air drifted from the darkness beyond. Atlas stepped forward immediately. The room inside was larger than Caleb expected. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Metal filing cabinets stood in neat rows. Wooden crates rested in corners beneath thick layers of dust. Nothing looked abandoned in haste. Everything looked intentionally preserved. Like someone had wanted this place found one day. Caleb slowly swept the flashlight across the room. Walter, what were you involved in? Atlas walked directly to a desk positioned near the far wall. The German shepherd stopped and nudged a leather-bound journal lying beneath a film of dust. Caleb picked it up. The cover was cracked with age. Inside, neat handwriting filled the pages. The first entry carried a date from more than 50 years earlier. Caleb read aloud. If you are reading this, then Atlas has done his job. He froze. Atlas looked up immediately. That is impossible. Caleb turned the page. The writer continued. The dog will find the path because loyalty always finds the truth. Caleb stared at the words. The journal had been written decades before Atlas was born. Yet somehow it felt as though the author knew exactly what would happen. He continued reading. The entries described a group of military personnel assigned to safeguard sensitive records connected to a classified operation. Most names had been blacked out. Entire pages had sections removed. But one name appeared repeatedly. Harlan. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. The same name, again and again. Atlas suddenly stood alert. His ears pointed toward the staircase above. Caleb closed the journal immediately. What is it? The dog remained frozen. Listening, then came a sound, faint, distant, a vehicle engine somewhere outside the cabin. Caleb switched off the flashlight. Silence filled the underground room. Another sound followed, a truck door closing. Atlas moved closer to him. Victor, Caleb whispered. Snow had been falling heavily for hours. No visitor should have been out here this late. Yet someone had arrived, and somehow Caleb knew it was not a coincidence. He slipped the journal into his jacket and looked toward the dark staircase. Whatever secrets Walter had hidden beneath the cabin, someone else clearly wanted them found first. Caleb waited in complete darkness for nearly 2 minutes. The only sounds were the faint hum of the winter wind above, and Atlas breathing quietly beside him. Then another noise drifted through the cabin floor. Footsteps, slow, careful. Whoever had arrived was inside. Caleb rested one hand on the journal hidden beneath his coat. Atlas remained perfectly still, but the fur along his neck had risen. Stay close, Caleb whispered. The dog immediately moved beside him. Together they climbed the stone staircase and emerged into the cabin. Moonlight spilled through the frosted windows. The fire had nearly died. Caleb scanned the room. Nothing seemed disturbed at first. Then he noticed the front door standing slightly open. Cold air drifted inside. Snowflakes danced across the floorboards. Atlas moved toward the doorway and sniffed. Caleb followed. Fresh boot prints crossed the porch and disappeared into the darkness. Whoever had entered had already left. That is strange, Caleb muttered. He stepped outside. The clearing was silent. No truck, no headlights, no sign of movement. Only fresh snow and a distant line of pine trees swaying beneath the stars. Atlas suddenly turned his head toward the edge of the property. His ears locked forward. Caleb followed his gaze. A faint light flickered through the forest, not bright enough to be a house. More like a flashlight, then it vanished. You saw that too, did you not? Atlas gave a low huff. Caleb returned inside and secured the door. Sleep was impossible now. He sat beside the fireplace and opened the journal again. The next few pages contained maps, dates, and handwritten notes. One entry caught his attention immediately. January 14, 1973. If anything happens to me, the records must never fall into Harlan hands. Caleb read the line twice, then a third time. Beneath it was a list of names. Some had been crossed out. Others remained untouched. At the very bottom was a location, Black Creek Ridge, 10 miles north of the cabin. Atlas suddenly stood and walked toward a filing cabinet inside the hidden room below. Caleb followed him back underground. The dog stopped beside the lowest drawer and tapped it with his paw. You are becoming very specific tonight. Caleb pulled the drawer open. Inside sat a single manila envelope. Unlike everything else in the room, it looked newer. He opened it carefully. Several photographs slid into his hands. The first showed a group of men standing beside military vehicles decades earlier. The second showed a warehouse. The third made Caleb pause. A younger version of Victor Harlan stood beside an older man who looked remarkably similar. Father and son. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a short message. The truth is buried where the water disappears. Caleb stared at the words. What does that even mean? Atlas nudged another item hidden inside the envelope, a folded survey map. Caleb spread it across the desk. A blue line marked a seasonal creek running through the mountains north of the property. One location had been circled repeatedly in red ink, Black Creek Ridge, the same place mentioned in the journal. Caleb looked from the map to the photograph and then toward Atlas. The German shepherd was already staring at him, as though waiting for a decision. Caleb folded the map carefully. Looks like we are taking a trip tomorrow. Atlas wagged his tail once, just once. Then a sudden knock echoed through the cabin above. 3 slow taps against the front door. Caleb froze. The knock came again, this time louder, and a familiar voice called from outside. Mr. Walker, I think we need to talk. Caleb looked toward the ceiling as the knock echoed through the cabin once more. Atlas was already moving toward the staircase. The German shepherd climbed ahead of him and stopped near the hidden entrance, listening. Easy, Caleb whispered. He folded the map, slipped the journal beneath his coat, and followed Atlas back into the cabin. The knock came a third time, slow, patient, confident. Caleb crossed the room and opened the door a few inches. Victor Harlan stood on the porch beneath the falling snow. A lantern glowed in one hand. The wind pushed flakes across his coat. You keep strange hours, Caleb said. Victor smiled faintly. So do you. Neither man spoke for a moment. Atlas stood beside Caleb, staring directly at Victor. Mind if I come in? Victor asked. I do. The smile remained. Fair enough. Victor glanced toward the surrounding forest. Beautiful place, quiet, almost forgotten. What do you want? Caleb asked. Victor sighed softly. I came to help you. Caleb laughed once. It was not a friendly laugh. You drove 10 miles through a snowstorm to help me? Victor nodded. Because I knew Walter. That answer changed everything. Caleb's expression hardened. You knew my uncle? For many years. Funny. The journal I found seems to suggest something different. For the first time, Victor's smile faded, only slightly. But Caleb noticed. Atlas noticed too. The dog stepped forward 1 pace. Victor lowered his eyes toward him. That animal does not trust me. Neither do I. Snow drifted between them. Victor placed the lantern on the porch rail. Walter was stubborn. He spent years chasing ghosts, secrets, old stories that should have been left alone. Caleb folded his arms. You seem very interested in what he left behind. Victor looked past him into the cabin. I am interested in protecting people from making mistakes. That sounds expensive. Victor chuckled quietly. Everything valuable is expensive. He reached into his coat and removed another envelope, much thicker than the first, $20,000. Caleb stared at it. For a cabin you claim is worthless? Victor did not answer immediately. The silence said enough. You should take the offer, Victor finally said. Walk away, start over somewhere warm. Caleb shook his head. No. Victor studied him carefully. You have not even asked what is hidden here, because I plan to find out myself. The wind grew stronger. Pine branches swayed against the dark sky. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Some discoveries bring more trouble than they are worth. Caleb stepped forward until they stood only a few feet apart. Then maybe you should stop looking for them. Neither man moved. Atlas released a low growl. Victor slowly picked up the lantern. You remind me of Walter. That is not the compliment you think it is. Victor nodded once. Perhaps not. He turned toward the snowy path leading into the trees. Then he stopped. Without looking back, he said, If you go north to Black Creek Ridge, be careful what you trust. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Victor should not have known about Black Creek Ridge. He had never mentioned the map, never mentioned the journal. Yet Victor had spoken the name as if he already knew. Atlas immediately barked once. Sharp, certain. Victor continued walking through the snow until darkness swallowed him completely. Caleb remained on the porch, staring into the forest. Beside him, Atlas kept his eyes fixed on the same direction long after Victor disappeared. Then the dog suddenly turned and sprinted toward the tree line on the opposite side of the property. Atlas, Caleb called. The German shepherd stopped beside an old pine tree near the edge of the clearing and began pawing at the snow. Caleb hurried after him. Beneath 6 inches of fresh powder, something metallic reflected the moonlight. The metal object beneath the snow turned out to be an old survey marker driven deep into the frozen ground. Caleb brushed away the remaining powder, while Atlas continued sniffing around the base of the pine tree. Moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting silver patterns across the clearing. Attached to the marker was a weathered brass plate engraved with coordinates. Caleb compared them to the map from the hidden room. His pulse quickened. "This is it, boy." Atlas immediately looked up. Black Creek Ridge. The German shepherd gave a short bark and began moving deeper into the forest. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and followed. The trail was barely visible beneath fresh snow, but Atlas moved with absolute confidence. For nearly half a mile they climbed through dense pines until the trees suddenly opened into a narrow valley. A frozen creek wound through the center like a ribbon of glass. Caleb stopped. The place felt strangely familiar despite never having seen it before. Atlas trotted toward a cluster of boulders near the creek bank and began circling one particular rock. "What did you find?" Caleb asked. The dog scratched at the snow. Beneath it lay a rusted steel hatch almost completely hidden by decades of brush and earth. Caleb stared in disbelief. "Another one?" Atlas sat beside it as if to say yes. The hatch opened with surprising ease. Below was a small underground chamber no larger than a garden shed. Inside stood a single steel cabinet. No gold, no jewels, no piles of money. Just one cabinet waiting in silence. Caleb stepped closer and opened the door. Rows of neatly organized folders filled the shelves. He removed the first file and opened it beneath the flashlight beam. His eyes widened immediately. Property deeds, land records, financial documents, hundreds of them, every page connected to a network of transactions stretching back more than 50 years. Names appeared repeatedly. Companies, properties, trusts. Then one name appeared again and again. Harlan. Caleb pulled another folder, then another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Entire sections of land around Seeley Lake had quietly changed ownership through shell companies connected to the Harlan family. Hidden transfers, undisclosed agreements. Records that had never been made public. Walter was not protecting treasure, Caleb whispered. He was protecting evidence. Atlas nudged a final folder resting alone on the bottom shelf. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age. "Dear Caleb, if you are reading this, then I was right to leave everything to you. Not because of the cabin. Not because of the land. Because you would choose truth over profit." Caleb swallowed hard and continued reading. The letter explained that Walter had spent years documenting activities he believed were dishonest. He had hidden the records because too many people wanted them gone. At the bottom of the final page was one last message. "The proof is not here. This only points the way. Follow the water where it disappears." Caleb lowered the letter slowly. The exact same phrase written on the photograph. Atlas suddenly stood and stared toward the frozen creek, his ears locked forward. "You heard something?" Caleb asked. The dog took off running along the ice-covered waterway. Caleb hurried after him. 50 yards ahead, the creek vanished beneath a rocky hillside. Atlas stopped beside a narrow opening hidden behind hanging branches. Cold air drifted out from the darkness within. Caleb shined his flashlight inside and froze. Deep in the shadows, something reflected the light. Not one thing, dozens of things. Rows upon rows of metal storage cases stretching far into the mountain. Caleb stood at the entrance of the hidden cavern, while Atlas stared into the darkness ahead. The beam from the flashlight swept across dozens of steel storage cases, arranged in perfect rows. Dust covered everything, yet the organization remained untouched. Someone had built this place to last. "Walter, what did you find?" Caleb whispered. Atlas moved forward first. The German shepherd walked slowly between the cases, nose working carefully. Caleb followed. Each container carried the same military insignia he had seen beneath the cabin. Dates, serial numbers, reference codes. Nothing meant much until he opened the first case. Inside were documents sealed in protective sleeves, maps, survey reports, engineering studies, land assessments covering thousands of acres across western Montana. Caleb opened another case, then another. The pattern became clear. These were not ordinary records. They documented valuable mineral deposits, underground water reserves, and land acquisitions that had never been publicly disclosed. Entire regions had been quietly undervalued for decades. Caleb sat back in disbelief. This is worth a fortune. Atlas suddenly stopped near the far wall and stared toward a narrow passage disappearing deeper into the mountain. Before Caleb could investigate, a voice echoed through the cavern. You finally found it. Caleb turned instantly. Victor Harlan stood near the entrance holding a lantern. Snow covered his coat. His expression was calm, almost relieved. Atlas stepped between the two men. Easy, boy, Victor said quietly. Atlas was not interested in listening. Caleb rose to his feet. You followed us. Victor nodded. I followed Walter for years. Now I followed you. Caleb looked around the cavern. This is what you wanted. Victor slowly walked forward. Not the papers, the truth hidden behind them. He gestured toward the cases. Those records prove something very important. My father knew this land held enormous value. Walter discovered it too. Caleb remained silent. Victor continued. The difference is that Walter believed everyone deserved to know. My father believed releasing the information would create chaos. And what do you believe? Caleb asked. Victor stopped a few feet away. For the first time, the confidence in his face seemed tired. I believe both of them were partly right. The answer surprised Caleb. Atlas watched carefully. Victor looked around the cavern. Do you know how many people spent their lives searching for this place? Caleb shook his head. Enough to ruin friendships, enough to destroy families. His voice softened. My father spent decades trying to find these records. Walter spent decades hiding them. Caleb glanced at the rows of cases. Then why offer me money? Victor smiled sadly. Because I thought you would take it. And if I had, you would have walked away. Silence settled between them. The cavern felt strangely peaceful despite everything. Water dripped softly from somewhere deep within the mountain. Finally, Victor looked directly at Caleb. The records belonged to the public. Walter knew that. Deep down, so did my father. Caleb studied him carefully. The greed he had expected was not there, only regret. Atlas slowly relaxed and sat beside Caleb. Victor noticed, that dog trusts people faster than I deserve. Caleb almost smiled. No, he usually knows exactly what he is doing. Victor laughed quietly. For the first time, it sounded genuine. Together, they opened the final storage case resting against the rear wall. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed simply to Caleb Walker. Beneath it rested a small brass key and one final handwritten note. The note contained only a single sentence. The greatest treasure was never hidden underground. Caleb stared at the envelope for a long moment before carefully opening it. Atlas sat beside him, calm now, his amber eyes reflecting the lantern light. Victor remained silent across the cavern. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten letter. Caleb immediately recognized the signature at the bottom, Walter. He began reading aloud. Caleb, if you have reached this place, then you have already discovered what took me most of my life to understand. People spend years chasing money, land, and secrets, believing they are searching for treasure. They are not. They are searching for belonging. Caleb paused. The words settled heavily in the quiet cavern. He continued. The records in this mountain must be shared. The land should help the communities that have protected it for generations. The water, reserves, the mineral surveys, the forgotten claims. All of it belongs in the light, but none of that is the inheritance I wanted to leave you. Caleb swallowed and looked down at the next line. The key opens cabin number 7 at the edge of the property. I hope it gives you something I never had the courage to keep for myself. A home. Silence filled the cavern. Even Victor looked away for a moment. Atlas nudged Caleb's hand gently. Yeah, Caleb whispered. I hear you. 3 weeks later, winter sunlight spilled across the mountains as trucks from the county, historians, surveyors, and legal teams arrived to document the discovery. The records proved invaluable. Several long-forgotten land agreements were corrected. Conservation projects received funding. Local families recovered property rights that had been buried in paperwork for decades. Reporters called it one of the most remarkable historical discoveries in Montana history. Caleb avoided every interview he could. One afternoon, Victor found him repairing a porch railing outside cabin number 7. The structure sat overlooking a frozen meadow surrounded by tall pines. Smoke drifted peacefully from the chimney. Victor handed him a small box. What is this? Caleb asked. Something my father should have returned years ago. Caleb opened it. Inside rested an old military compass engraved with Walter's initials. He looked up. Victor smiled faintly. It belongs here. Caleb nodded. Thank you. Victor glanced toward Atlas sleeping near the porch steps. That dog changed everything. Caleb looked at Atlas and smiled. He usually does. The months passed. Spring arrived. Snow melted from the hillsides. Wildflowers pushed through the earth. The cabin slowly became a real home, not because of the land, not because of the discovery. Because for the first time in many years, Caleb stopped wondering where he would sleep next week. One evening he sat on the porch while the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Atlas rested beside him, head across his boots. The air smelled of pine, fresh grass, and distant rain. Caleb reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know, boy, I thought I inherited a cabin." Atlas lifted his head. Caleb smiled softly. "Turns out I inherited a future." The dog leaned against his leg and closed his eyes. The valley grew quiet as golden light settled across the meadow, and for the first time in a very long time, Caleb Walker felt exactly where he belonged. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.